Okay, so we're standing in Ruther, Glen, Virginia area, and we're at the Carmel Baptist Church, and they've really done a wonderful job here in preserving some old prints and some old artifacts, and it just gets better all the time. And so we appreciate so much opportunity to be able to be here today and see what they're doing. So if you're ever in Virginia, I hope you will get a chance to stop here. It's north of Richmond off of 95. It's not difficult to find, the Carmel Baptist Church. It goes by today. It was once called the Polecat Church and then Burris' Meeting House or Church, and now it's called the Carmel Baptist Church. And so if you can contact them, and we'll give the information, you'll be able to visit this at some time. And it's just a wonderful blessing to be able to be here. What you're looking at here is representative of the many, many persecutions of the Virginia Baptist ministers during this time frame by the Anglican State Church and the Anglican State Church constables, simply for preaching the gospel contrary to the Anglican doctrine and for not taking a license and submitting their consciences to the state, as Leland would put it. And so we're looking at John Waller. We've been talking a lot about Waller and seen different places he was arrested and seen different places he was in prison. And we're going to actually be going to the old Lower Spotsylvania Baptist Church, which is now called Waller's Baptist Church, after their infamous preacher, who was once Swearing Jack, got gloriously saved, and took his God-given name, John Waller, back. And we talked about his connection with Abraham Marshall and Daniel Marshall, and how that Abraham married Waller's daughter, took her south, and then of course he went down to see his grandbabies, but he continued birthing churches even when he got down into South Carolina. Well, here you have Waller, and I just want to read you what Morgan Edwards left us in his material towards history of the Baptists in Virginia. He chronicled this severe persecution endured by Waller. He said, and I quote, "In the spring of 1771, as he was holding divine worship in Caroline County, the minister of the parish and his clerk with the sheriff came to the place. The minister rode up to the stage, and as Mr. Waller began to pray, ran the end of his whip into Waller's mouth and silenced him." This is just previous to the whip ramming episode. "The clerk pulled Waller down and dragged him to the sheriff, who stood at a distance. The sheriff received him and whipped him in so violent a manner, without the ceremony of a trial, that poor Waller was presently in a gore of blood, and will carry the scars to his grave. Waller, sore and bloody as he was, remounted the stage and preached a most extraordinary sermon, thereby showing that beaten oil is the best for the sanctuary. He spoke of getting up, wiping the dust and blood off of himself, and mounting the pulpit and preaching again with a great degree of liberty." There's that indomitable spirit. Waller, in a letter from the Middlesex County Jail in 1771, wrote, "Yesterday we had a large number of people to hear us preach, and among others, many of the great ones of the land, who behaved well, while one of us discoursed on the new birth. It is evident that what men thought of for evil, God meant for good. Manifold were his trials, yet multiplied were his triumphs. His work as a pastor and itinerant was crowned with success, and seasons of revival were common. For 35 years he labored to increase the kingdom of God, during which time he baptized over 2,000 converts. He organized more than 20 churches and ordained over 30 men to the ministry." Let me just stop for a moment. So talk about Samuel Harris possibly birthing 60 churches, ordaining dozens of men, him and James Reed, and then those who were sent from their influences. Okay, you have Schubel, and you have Daniel Marshall goes out, and those that get saved under his ministry, they reproduce churches, and those churches reproduce churches. This is that massive snowball effect we talked about of the Separate Baptist Revival, stretching down into South Carolina, over to Georgia, across the mountains into Tennessee, up into Virginia, across into Kentucky, and just everywhere. And so he was key to this, and his manner was just like the other Separate Baptists. He was an avid church planner and soul winner. His willingness to suffer as the Lord's adjutant helped secure the religious liberty enjoyed today by every citizen of the United States. To God be the glory. John Waller, as I mentioned, moved to South Carolina in 1793 and faithfully served the Lord as pastor of this church, that particular church, until removed by death July 4th, 1802. He is buried in the family cemetery near Greenwood, South Carolina. That last section was put on a marker that's actually in South Carolina at the church that Waller started down there, and that's the Bethabara Baptist Church. And so the last section was from the Baptist History Preservation Society. The first section up to the beaten oil is best for the sanctuary, that was actually from Morgan Edwards in his materials towards a history of the Baptists in Virginia. And so what a wonderful story that these men just kept on going. And so he finished his life birthing churches. I don't know if we can imagine what it would be like just to birth, 5 or 10 churches, but then 30 churches or 60 churches. But that was what the climate was, and that's who the Separate Baptists were. So when I spoke on the Separate Baptists on Sunday night, again, you wonder, how could there have been 1,000 churches come out of this revival? Well, now you're starting to see these churches and all these different signs and all these different places and these nooks and crannies back in the hills and hollers and places where they started churches. So it's a glorious history we have.